August 1945, Tokyo. The city lay in ruins. Smoke still curled from the skeletons of buildings. Children searched for scraps among the ashes, their faces hollow, their feet bare against the blackened ground. A distant hum broke the silence. Engines. Rhythmic, mechanical. American trucks. Soldiers in khaki uniforms, helmets glinting in the weak sunlight, moving through the shattered streets that had once been their enemy's capital. Every step was watched from doorways and cellars. Mothers clutched their children, whispering prayers. For years, they had been told these men were monsters. Then, one soldier reached into his pack. He held out a can, then another. Chocolate, tinned meat, warm bread from a field kitchen. No one moved. Then slowly a child stepped forward. When the first bite was taken, the tears began to fall. The war had ended, but something even greater had begun. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a nation on its knees. Once proud, once relentless, it now stood in the shadow of annihilation. Cities were flattened, farmlands had been burned, trains no longer ran. The empire that had stretched across the Pacific was shrinking by the hour. In March, Tokyo endured the deadliest air raid in human history. B-29 bombers swept across the night sky, releasing waves of incendiaries that turned neighborhoods into infernos. More than 100,000 people died in a single night. The survivors could do little but bury the dead and search for water amid the rubble. Food was scarce. Rice, Japan's lifeblood, was rationed to mere ounces per day. Families boiled bark and weeds for soup. Children collapsed in schoolyards. People bartered kimonos for potatoes, watches for a handful of barley. And yet, propaganda still echoed from loudspeakers. Fight to the death. Never surrender. The Japanese government had promised that the Americans would bring only cruelty and humiliation. Posters showed grotesque caricatures of American soldiers, giants who would destroy, enslave, and desecrate the sacred soil of Japan. So when Hiroshima vanished in a flash of blinding light, and then Nagasaki followed, many still could not believe the truth. Even as the emperor's voice trembled across the radio waves on August 15th, surrendering unconditionally, the fear remained. What would become of them when the enemy arrived? The occupation began under General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. His task was not only to demilitarize Japan, but to rebuild it from ashes. When American forces landed, they found a nation starving and broken. In Tokyo alone, millions were homeless. Across the countryside, trains carried refugees from burned-out cities, their suitcases filled with nothing but memories. Many Americans expected hatred, perhaps violence, from the people they had fought. Instead, they met silence and bowed heads. The Japanese people watched from a distance, uncertain whether they should hide or greet these strangers who had once been enemies. MacArthur understood the fragility of the moment. One act of cruelty could ignite resistance. One gesture of kindness could change everything. Orders were clear. Treat civilians with dignity. Share what you can. Prevent famine at all costs. Soon, the occupation force, nearly 400,000 men, began distributing rations, not just to their own troops, but to civilians. American field kitchens opened in the ruins of cities. Trucks rolled through bombed districts carrying flour, canned goods, and powdered milk. And in those early days, the smallest gestures would become the most unforgettable. To understand what those moments meant, one must imagine life for the ordinary Japanese civilian in 1945. Families lived in makeshift shelters, fragments of houses patched together with debris. At night, the wind carried the smell of ash and sewage. Hospitals were overcrowded. Medicine was nearly gone. For years, the government had promised final victory. Every death had been declared glorious. Yet now, defeat was undeniable, and so was the emptiness in every stomach. When American soldiers entered these neighborhoods, children hid behind their mothers. The soldiers, young and weary themselves, looked upon the devastation in silence. Many were only 19 or 20, men who had fought at Okinawa or Iwo Jima, who had seen their own friends die. Yet what they saw in Japan was not an enemy anymore. It was humanity stripped bare. There are countless accounts from both sides. American GIs setting down their rifles and handing out rations to barefoot children. Japanese civilians bowing deeply, overwhelmed by an act of mercy they had been told would never come. One recalled how the soldiers gave him chocolate, his first taste of sweetness in years. Another remembered the smell of canned peaches, shared by men who had arrived prepared for hate but found only hunger. These moments, though small, carried an unimaginable weight. They marked the first cracks in a wall of fear built by war. Behind this compassion lay strategy, one born of both necessity and principle. General MacArthur knew that victory on the battlefield was meaningless without peace in the hearts of the conquered. Japan had to be rebuilt, not humiliated. A starving nation could not become a stable ally. So, the United States redirected vast quantities of surplus military rations to Japan. Between 1945 and 1946, over 800,000 tons of food and supplies were shipped across the Pacific. The goal was not only to prevent famine, but to transform perception, to show the Japanese people that their former enemy sought not vengeance, but coexistence. This approach was revolutionary. Never before had a defeated power been treated with such deliberate humanity. The act of feeding the defeated enemy became a moral statement, a message to the world that peace required more than surrender. It required compassion. American soldiers, many of whom had lost brothers in the Pacific, carried out this mission with quiet discipline. Some wrote home that giving food felt more powerful than firing a rifle. For the Japanese, it was disorienting. The propaganda had promised torture, not kindness. When soldiers knelt to hand a biscuit to a crying child, the image shattered years of indoctrination. Slowly, fear gave way to trust. Trust became gratitude, and gratitude began to plant the seeds of something unimaginable: friendship. The turning point came in the autumn of 1945. In cities like Yokohama, Osaka, and Tokyo, field kitchens began serving thousands of civilians daily. Long lines formed at dawn. Women, children, old men clutching tin bowls. Soldiers ladled out stew, rice, and coffee. It was a strange sight. The conquerors feeding the conquered. In photographs taken that season, you can see faces that no longer hide. Children laugh as they taste sugar for the first time. Women weep openly as soldiers smile awkwardly, unsure how to react. One soldier later wrote in his diary, "I saw them cry over a loaf of bread." I'll never forget that. Even in the countryside, patrols shared their sea rations, chocolate bars, canned beef, powdered eggs. Villagers bowed so deeply their foreheads touched the ground. Many whispered the only English they knew, "Thank you." The shock of that kindness rippled through the nation. Rumors spread that the Americans were not monsters after all. The same men who had burned their cities were now saving their children. In those moments, hatred, carefully cultivated through years of war, began to dissolve. As winter approached, the humanitarian mission expanded. Schools reopened, aided by American supplies. Relief organizations distributed powdered milk and medical aid. Japanese police worked alongside American MPs to maintain order, a remarkable cooperation only months after surrender. By early 1946, Japanese newspapers, once instruments of militarist propaganda, began printing articles praising the Americans' conduct. Words like reconstruction and hope replaced revenge and defiance. For many civilians, the emotional turning point came when they realized the Americans were risking their own comfort to feed them. Soldiers went hungry themselves at times, giving away their rations to children in rags. These acts of compassion spread faster than any command. They became stories whispered through ruined neighborhoods, stories that restored faith in humanity itself. Historians later called it the beginning of Japan's rebirth. But for those who lived it, it was simpler. It was the moment the war truly ended in their hearts. A woman from Hiroshima later said, "When the soldier gave my son a biscuit, I felt peace for the first time. That was the real victory, not of armies, but of empathy." The American occupation continued for 7 years. During that time, Japan transformed more rapidly than any nation in modern history. Food programs became institutional. The United States shipped millions of tons of wheat, rice, and milk powder under what would later become the foundations of international aid policy. The Japanese government, guided by MacArthur's administration, introduced democratic reforms, rebuilt industry, and established new systems of education and welfare. The memory of those early acts of kindness became part of the nation's collective conscience. Children who once cried over a piece of chocolate grew up remembering the faces of foreign soldiers who had shown mercy. Many became teachers, doctors, and officials in the new Japan, a country determined never to return to the darkness of war. The alliance that would later define the Pacific began not with treaties, but with meals shared among ruins. By the early 1950s, Japan had re-emerged as a thriving democracy. The U.S.-Japan Security Treaty turned former enemies into strategic allies. American culture spread through the streets of Tokyo. Jazz music, baseball, cinema. Yet behind the modern facade, an unspoken gratitude endured. Elderly survivors still told stories of the soldiers who gave them food when the world had forgotten them. Historians often debate the political motives behind American aid, but to the people who lived through starvation, it was something deeper. It was proof that compassion could exist even between those who had once sought each other's destruction. Decades later, many veterans returned to Japan, not as conquerors, but as guests. They were welcomed with flowers, with tears, with words that needed no translation. The bitterness of war had given birth to one of history's most enduring friendships. War destroys. It burns cities, divides nations, and poisons generations with fear. Yet even in its ashes, humanity has a way of re-emerging. In 1945, Japan learned that mercy can be more powerful than any weapon, and America discovered that rebuilding an enemy could be the truest form of victory. When American soldiers shared their rations, they did more than feed the hungry. They fed hope. They reminded a defeated people that compassion could still exist, even after the world had ended. Those who wept over a single loaf of bread were not just crying for hunger. They were crying because, for the first time in years, someone had shown them kindness. History often remembers the bombs, the battles, the blood. But sometimes, the real story lies in the quiet acts that followed, when an army of conquerors became an army of givers, and the world learned that peace begins with a single shared meal.